this here is the Sony A1, and over the past couple of years, it's been my main photography camera. But early last week, Sony released their A1 Mark II, the updated version of this camera. So in this video, I'll give you guys a quick rundown of the features, the specs, as well as the price, and explain to you guys why I decided to pull the trigger and upgrade to the A1 Mark II. But I'll also explain why you might not want to upgrade to the A1 Mark II, as well as give you guys some alternative solutions that might fit your specific needs for a camera a little bit better. If you're new to this channel, welcome. My name is Spencer. I'm a landscape and astrophotographer based here in the beautiful Hawaiian Islands. And for full disclaimer, I wasn't one of those YouTubers that received the A1 Mark II as a pre-production model. I'm still waiting for my fully production model that I paid money for to come in the mail. So this review is primarily just going to be kind of like a preview of the specs and the features based off of Sony's press release, as well as some other YouTubers' videos. So definitely keep that in mind while watching this video. So the Sony A1 Mark II reuses some specs that were originally found on the Sony A1. The first being the stacked 50 megapixel sensor. Now, this sensor, in my use case after using this camera for a couple of years, has given me zero problems whatsoever. Its 50 megapixels is really high resolution and creates beautiful images, and it actually performs extremely well in low light and at high ISOs, like 3200 up to 6400. Just creates beautiful images that you wouldn't expect such a high resolution sensor to perform that well in extreme low light conditions. So they reuse the same sensor for that. And this is typical of Sony. They usually reuse the same sensor multiple times for a couple of generations before switching it up in the third generation. So, you know, while people may complain about them not updating the sensor, I don't think it's that big of a deal because this sensor was amazing when it was released 4 years ago, and it's still amazing to this day. Now, it's not a global shutter like the A9 Mark III, so it doesn't have full readout of the sensor at the exact same time. But in my experience, I've never had issues with the readout speed on the original A1. It was still extremely fast at 50 megapixels, and I think that has to do with the fact that it's a stacked sensor. So that definitely helps in those fast action moments, and I've never had any issues with, let's say, rolling shutter or any problems that typically come with a high resolution sensor. And another downside for using a global shutter is the fact that you get slightly worse dynamic range and slightly higher noise in your images. So definitely happy that they didn't quite make this a global shutter as of yet. And speaking of noise, I'm also glad that they decided to keep the mechanical shutter in this camera. At least that's what all the reviews are saying so far. I'll definitely double check that for you guys. But I went into this on last week's video going over the A7C Mark II, where they got rid of the mechanical shutter and therefore the images got worse when shooting in extreme low light for astrophotography. So I'm definitely happy that they decided to leave the mechanical shutter in for the use case for us astrophotographers. Whew, this scene is coming together nicely. Now, in terms of video specs, they pretty much kept everything identical to the original A1. We're still maxed out at a resolution of 8K at 30 frames per second. Now, this is slightly a little bit of a disappointment, as more modern cameras nowadays from Canon and Nikon can film 8K up to 60 frames per second. And it's also a bummer that they didn't include any internal RAW recording functionality to this camera. I think that definitely would have helped it in the video department, especially when filming videos in extreme low light like I do. With that being said, I don't think that just the fact that it kind of skimps a little bit on the video features makes it a deal breaker, because RAW recording and 8K 60 frames per second aren't necessarily modes that a lot of people shoot in anyways, or it's not really practical for a lot of people. But for my use case, when filming vlogs in extreme low light, that's definitely something that I wish we got with the A1 Mark II. In terms of new features for the A1 Mark II, I think the most revolutionary has to be the pre-capture functionality. Now, what pre-capture does is it allows the camera to store a buffer of images when you half press the shutter button. And even if you don't fully depress the shutter button and let's say you miss the action by even up to like a second, once you fully depress the shutter button, the camera will save whatever buffer you have set. That way, it makes wildlife photography, makes action photography almost like cheating. It's almost like if you miss the shot, then you'll still get the shot. Now again, this is going to be a game changer and most applicable to those wildlife and sports photographers out there. And while I kind of dabble a little bit with wildlife photography here and there. I don't do it a whole lot. I'm also interested though to see how this feature performs for seascape photography, especially those telephoto wave shots that we do from time to time, and also even just our regular seascape photography shots. Sometimes those waves and the water flows can be a little bit unpredictable at times. So I think this pre-capture function will definitely help me from that standpoint. Now I want to mention that the pre-capture functionality was first introduced on, I believe, the Nikon Z9 and the Nikon Z8, but you can only do it in JPEG. Now Canon allowed you to do it in RAW with their R5 Mark II, but the functionality is only set to about half a second. The flexibility that the Alpha 1 Mark II brings, as well as the A9 Mark III, is it allows you to push that pre-capture buffer up to a second and even customize it to be anywhere from like a second down to 1/3 of a second. So as of recording this video, Sony definitely does the pre-capture functionality the best out of all three of the major camera brands. Sony also threw in their new AI processing chip that was first introduced in the A7R5. Now the autofocus performance on the original Alpha 1 was already really good, so this AI processing chip is only just going to make it that much better. I think the biggest features that come from this AI processing chip is, number one, the auto subject selection mode when both taking photos and videos. Before, when you were switching subjects, let's say from like humans to birds and back to animals, you would have to manually switch your subject recognition in between each time you tried to take a picture of something different. But with this new auto mode, it allows you to kind of pick and choose between which subjects that you are generally thinking about shooting. In my case, it's probably going to be limited to animals and birds and nothing else, because I rarely ever shoot humans, and I definitely don't shoot plane, trains, cars, and whatnot. But you can get rid of all of those other things, and the camera will only focus on finding birds or animals, and you no longer have to worry about toggling between those two modes. Another thing that they did is add animal eye autofocus to video mode. This mode was only limited to photo shooting mode with the original Alpha 1, so it's definitely a welcome upgrade to add it into the video mode functionality. And in addition to that, it also gets the auto framing functionality as well as the dynamic active steady shot functionality originally found in this camera, the A1. So definitely a welcome upgrade to see, especially because we're filming in 8K and you've got that resolution to crop without losing too much image quality. Another, what seemingly is kind of small function that they added on the software side of things is allowing us the ability to zoom while in the bright monitoring mode. Now, shout out to Mads Peter Iverson for finding this in his video. Definitely go watch his video with his pre-production model of the Alpha 1 Mark II. But if you're unfamiliar with the bright monitoring mode, what this does is, let's say you're shooting astrophotography, it's pitch black, you can't see your subject, you can't frame it up whatsoever. When you enable this mode to a custom button, when you are in manual focus mode, you can depress that custom button, and what it'll do is it'll drop the frames per second of your LCD screen, but it'll also make your image a lot more brighter. So it makes it a lot easier to frame up your shots for astrophotography and extreme low light. But what would happen is, once you kind of got your composition set up, when you're manually focusing in with the lens to kind of focus in and make sure your stars are nice and sharp, what this would do is you would lose the brightness of the bright monitoring functionality. But with this update to the Alpha 1 Mark II, you're allowed to still keep the bright monitoring mode with zoom focusing. So that's definitely a feature that's welcome, especially for us astrophotographers. Now that's it for the software side, but the hardware side has also been updated. The Alpha 1 Mark II uses the same body as the A9 Mark III, which comes with a couple of kind of minor, but when all piled together, I think some pretty major updates to this camera. The first being the C5 custom button that sits kind of right here in between the grip and the lens, and that allows you to enable the speed boost functionality. Now the frames per second on this camera didn't actually improve. It's still locked in at 30 frames per second. That is compressed RAW though, so it's a high resolution RAW format, but 30 frames per second, that's exactly how it was 4 years ago with the original Alpha 1. What that kind of allows you to do is kind of save a little bit when it comes to like your burst mode and your burst functionality. You can set your camera to something more reasonable with frame rates like 10, 15, or 20 frames per second, and only when you need the 30 frames per second for, let's say, a quick burst of action, you can depress that custom button and get that extra speed boost when you need it. Because right now my workflow for wildlife photography is to just set it to 30 frames per second and just deal with the extra files, just make sure that I don't miss a moment. but this is actually a more efficient and convenient way to take advantage of that high burst rate and that high frames per second, while also, I guess, in the main thing is to save your buffer and save on SD card space. Try and film this without getting in my time lapse here, but you see this orange thing? That's the rotatable camera collar thing from Atoll. It's going to be interesting to see if that C5 custom button gets in the way of that camera collar, or that camera collar gets in the way of using the C5 custom button or whatever, because that might mean that I have to switch back to using an L bracket. Definitely let you guys know about that once the camera does come in. But the most important change for me has to be the addition of the fully articulating 4-axis tilty flippy screen, because as you can see on this model, you're kind of only limited to this one-way horizontal tilt axis screen here. Now, you can still do that with the Alpha One Mark II, but it also adds the kind of vlogging style of that vertical tilting LCD screen. Now, this is helpful for shooting vertical content because previously, without the fully articulating LCD screen, when you would flip the camera into vertical mode, get low to the ground to get nice foreground shots, you'd have to like bend your knees, bend your back, squat really low just to see your composition. But with that flip out LCD screen, it's going to allow you to just visualize your shot a whole lot better when shooting vertical. Now, it also unlocks the functionality of this camera to now be a vlogging camera, like a true vlogging camera. So on situations where I don't need the 12 megapixel sensor on the ZV-E1, like let's say I'm just going on a hike and I'm trying to make things as minimal as possible, I can leave the vlog camera or the bigger vlog camera at home and primarily use my Alpha One Mark II as the stills camera, as well as my primary video camera if I need it. And if I do need a second camera, like let's say I need to do a talking head shot with my composition or with my camera, I've always got the little small Pocket 3 that is much more packable than something like the ZV-E1. And there are some reports online that say that the A9 Mark III camera body is a little bit more weather sealed than the original Alpha One. And I hope that's the case, but there isn't anything official from Sony out quite yet talking about the weather sealing. So if there is something wrong with the weather sealing, or if something does go wrong, definitely you guys will be the first people to hear about it. I've roasted Sony for its terrible weather sealing in the past, and I will continue to roast them until they fix it. So only time will tell when it comes to the weather sealing, but that's something that we'll definitely put to the test with my type of photography. And another welcome addition is the mode dial selector, where you can toggle between photo, video, and S&Q mode. That was first seen, I believe, on the A7 IV. So because the Alpha One Mark II is a little bit more of a hybrid camera than the original Alpha One, because of that fully articulating LCD screen, it's going to be helpful to have this dial to kind of separate custom modes, custom functionality between photo and video mode, and making switching between the two of those modes a lot more seamless and easy to do. IBIS on the Mark II has also been upgraded from 5.5 stops from the original up to 8.5 stops. Now, that's something that we're obviously going to have to test when we get our hands on it. I think it's going to be most helpful for shooting bird still photo, and it's going to allow us to use longer shutter speeds without having to worry too much about camera shake. But what I'm actually interested in trying is seeing if we can shoot seascapes or shoot long exposures anywhere from like half a second to like 1/5 of a second. I wonder if the improved IBIS will allow us to do that and not have to use a tripod system, because sometimes shooting seascapes with a tripod can be somewhat limiting, but with technology up until this point, you kind of had to use a tripod to get a nice stable shot for a long exposure. But in addition to not having to be tied down to a tripod, that also allows you to be a little bit more nimble and allow you to run away from the waves when they are looking sketchy and starting to come in. So that's definitely something that I would love to test with the Alpha One Mark II whenever it does come in the mail. And they also added a couple of minor things. They added a new eyepiece cup, so looking through the viewfinder is much more ergonomic and comfortable. Meh. And they also added a dual battery charger instead of the single battery charger that they did previously. And that's supposed to be because battery life on the Alpha One Mark II is a lot worse. I guess due to like the AI functionality and processing power of the camera. But battery life is supposed to be more of an issue with the A1 Mark II. So definitely going to test that with our first astrophotography shoot, because at nighttime it gets cold. That's when batteries perform at its worst. So definitely something that I'm going to be eagerly looking forward to testing out with the A1 Mark II whenever that comes, whenever that time comes. But I never had problems with the original A1, so it's not terrible. That dual charger though, I don't know how useful it is going to be for my particular case, because I usually bring like tri-chargers because I have 2 cameras that I need to charge at a time, sometimes 3. So having a battery charger with 3 slots is obviously better than 2. It'd be nice to see them create like a 3 or a 4 charger battery pack, but I don't think that's gonna happen anytime soon. So now let's talk about price, and this probably has to be the worst part about getting the A1 Mark II, because the price is $6,500. Now, I guess it makes sense from Sony's standpoint, and if you look at it from their perspective, because the original A1 came out at the exact same price point at $6,500. So you don't want to like upgrade something and then make the upgrade that's better in every single way cheaper than what you originally released the first version for, because that's just going to piss off old users of the A1. So I guess if there is a rationale on why they did it that way, that is exactly why. But the problem is that technology back then, 4 years ago, was not as good as it is now. And the camera manufacturers like Nikon and Canon have pretty much caught up to Sony in terms of how good the camera performs, and we'll definitely get into alternative cameras from those camera brands in the next section of this video. Personally, for me, I'll be selling this original A1 as well as my A7C Mark II that I mentioned in the previous video to kind of help offset that high cost of the A1 Mark II. Whew. Yeah, sun definitely came out now. All right, so like I mentioned before, the A1 really expensive. I understand that the price is driving you away. I don't blame you. So I definitely want to go over some alternative recommendations to this camera, because yeah, that price is just it's something to behold of. For sure. I'm also going to give you guys a rationale on why, personally for me, I'm still going with the A1 Mark II, and why any of these alternatives don't really work for my workflow in particular, but obviously your workflow might differ. So I'm going to try and explain why these alternatives might work a little bit better, if that makes sense. So the first one we got here is the Canon R5 Mark II, coming in at $4,200, and even the original R5 at $2,800. Both of these guys are pretty much pound for pound similar to the original A1 and the R5, and the Mark IIs to the Mark IIs. They're pound for pound pretty similar. The added benefit, again, when it comes to video with the R5 Mark II, is that you can shoot up to 8K 60 frames per second. You can also shoot raw video as well. But the one thing that Canon will provide you definitely over Sony for a landscape or nature type of photographer is better weather sealing. Now, I've bashed Sony many times for their poor weather sealing performance, especially in their kind of lower end cameras. I've heard of multiple instances of Canon R5s going swimming in both fresh and salt water, having them being in there not for too long, but pulling them out of the water and them working just fine after that. So if weather sealing and durability are the most important thing to you, like let's say you shoot a lot of waterfalls, you shoot a lot of seascapes, a lot of salt water, definitely Canon is the way to go. For me personally though, I think the switching over to the Canon ecosystem isn't yet feasible for me yet, just due to the fact that they kind of lack in the video department, at least in terms of the extreme low light videography that I get from cameras like the ZV-E1. There isn't really anything quite equivalent to that on the Canon ecosystem, but probably if something were to come out from Canon's standpoint, I probably would switch to them in a heartbeat because of how harsh of the environments that I typically shoot in. Up next is the Nikon Z8, and this camera is probably the cheapest and the best bang for your buck, coming in at $3,500. And what this camera provides you is both access to the beautiful Nikon Z glass, but with third-party adapters like the newer adapter and the Mega adapter, it allows you to use Sony E-mount glass from Tamron, Sigma, as well as Sony on the Nikon ecosystem. Wow, it just got really bright. But that opens up a big range and a big variety of lenses. And the added benefit, again, of using the Nikon system is the fact that you don't get that stupid Sony hot shoe error message when the hot shoe gets wet. So big plus for using Sony lenses on Nikon camera bodies. I'll link to that video that I did on this topic up there somewhere. But the problem for me, at least, switching fully over to the Nikon ecosystem is the fact that on their higher end cameras like the Z8 and the Z9, they got rid of the physical mechanical shutter and just roll with an electronic front curtain shutter. And as I mentioned before, with that electronic front curtain shutter, you get slightly worse noise performance, especially at higher ISOs. So that's kind of reason number one why I don't really want to jump ship fully over to the Nikon cameras, even though I can adapt my lenses for the video cameras. The other thing too is that the Z8 body at least is pretty sizable and noticeably bigger than even the bigger Sony mirrorless camera bodies. So, and in addition to that, it doesn't have the fully articulating screen like the Alpha 1 Mark II does. So those three things alone just kind of make the Nikon system just not my preferred choice for photography. Now, I do still have the Nikon Z7 Mark II because that camera still kept its mechanical shutter. So I plan on using that for sketchy situations like on the Big Island when we're shooting the drains and that kind of thing. But for pretty much all other stuff, I think I'm still gonna stick with the Alpha 1. Now let's say you wanna stick within the Sony ecosystem. You can kind of live with the terrible weather sealing that it provides. The A7R5 coming in at $3,300 is a great option for you because you get a higher resolution sensor at 61 megapixels, which is pretty good at a lower price point. And you also get pretty much the same style of body, fully articulating LCD screen, so the ergonomics are great. And as long as you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of speed for wildlife and action, then I think the A7R5 might be the way to go. Another thing though that you also have to sacrifice with the A7R5 when compared to the Alpha 1 is noise performance at higher ISOs. And because I primarily shoot astrophotography now, that's kind of one of the more important things for me, hence why I'm spending a little bit more money to get the Alpha 1 Mark II instead of going with the R ecosystem. And again, I'm going to reference Peter Iverson's video on this topic because he did a very thorough test on the low light astrophotography noise performance of the A7R5 versus the Alpha 1 Mark II. So definitely check his video out. And basically his conclusion was the noise performance wasn't too terrible for a low light, but personally, for my taste, in my opinion, the noise performance on that 61 megapixel sensor is just not that great. So if you want ideally the best of the best, high resolution but also high noise performance, Alpha 1 is still definitely the way to go within the Sony ecosystem. Another great option within the Sony ecosystem is the A7 IV. Now you do get a little bit of resolution hit at coming in at only 33 megapixels. And again, you don't get the high frame rates and the high burst rates that you get with the Alpha 1. But if you're willing to sacrifice those two things, I think it's a great option coming in at around $2,000. It might also be advantageous if you're willing to wait a couple of months to early 2025 because the A7 V is supposed to be coming out during that time. And if that camera gets a resolution bump, I think it'd be an even better hybrid camera for both photos and videos. And again, as long as you're willing to sacrifice the speed for wildlife and action photography and you don't need that kind of stuff, then I think it would be a really great option to pick up one of the A7 cameras. And the last option that we're going to talk about, of course, is the original Alpha 1. And you can get these things, I think, on sale now, brand new, for around $5,500. But if you're willing to go to the used marketplace, you could probably get it even cheaper. And as long as you don't need the pre-capture, you don't need the AI autofocusing system, which you kind of don't really need because this autofocus system is still really, really good. And you don't need the fully articulating LCD screen, then you pretty much get like 90% of the Alpha 1 Mark II with the original Alpha 1. So definitely something to consider if you need the performance for wildlife photography, but you also want to save a little bit of money at the same time. This is still a really, really great camera in 2024 going into 2025. All right, so I've kind of made the argument that getting the Alpha 1 Mark II probably doesn't make sense for a lot of people. So why on earth would I pre-order it pretty much the day it was available to pre-order? Well, I think for me personally, this camera just performs extremely well in every single area that I need it to perform without compromise, and that's kind of the key. It's pretty much the best of the best when it comes to everything except for filming vlogs and video in extreme low light situations. That's where the ZV-E1 and that 12 megapixel sensor is still gonna kind of outperform it. But for pretty much everything else that I need it to do, it does it exceptionally well, or it promises to do it exceptionally well without compromise. And that's kind of the thing that I wanted to try and get to and explain my rationale for purchasing the Alpha 1 Mark II. And if you have been following this channel for a while, you'll know me as the person and the photographer that brings probably way too much camera gear into the field. You know, usually 1 or 2 camera bodies set up for like a seascape camera, time-lapse camera, and then of course a video camera as well. But overall, I want to kind of phase out that part of my photography. And obviously there are going to be those shoots where it's kind of almost required for me to have a couple of cameras available to run, especially for those nights, long nights of astrophotography. I think it's helpful to have a time-lapse camera as well as a regular camera to kind of run around and experiment with. But for pretty much everything else, I kind of want to slim down my kit and make things smaller, lighter, and more portable. At this point in my photography career, I'm getting older. I think my days of carrying 3 tripods into the field are kind of limited. So I want to transition my kit into being more lightweight, portable, minimal, to allow myself to be more nimble out here in the field, to get myself onto location faster, easier, and hike further and more into the wilderness with my camera gear. And I think the Alpha 1 Mark II will allow me to do that. And as long as I don't need, again, the ZV-E1 for any serious video or low light video, then I think I can get away with just using the Alpha 1 Mark II and the Pocket 3 for most of the shoots. And just keeping everything nice and minimal, nice and lightweight is definitely the direction that I want to go with my photography. So that definitely weighed heavily on my buying decision to get this camera. But overall, that's just my rationale for upgrading to the Alpha 1 Mark II. I kind of have to justify it to my bank account now, hence why I'm making this video. But definitely leave me your guys' thoughts in the comments below on the Alpha 1 Mark II. Are you going to be upgrading, or are you going to be saving your money and purchasing one of the alternative cameras that I previously mentioned? If you found this video helpful, make sure you hit that like button and leave a comment below. And if you like this type of content, this travel, vacation, and a little bit of photography education, make sure you subscribe to make sure you don't miss any of our future videos, because we're definitely going to be putting the Alpha 1 Mark II through its paces and testing it for wildlife, seascape, astrophotography. It's kind of our main bread and butter of what we do here on this channel. But yeah, until next time, we'll see you guys later. Peace out.